Thanks for taking a minute to drop by. Did you ever wonder what Joseph looked like? Did he have curly hair? What color were his eyes? How tall was he? Did he possess that schoolboy grin? Well, we're not sure, but this we do know. In Genesis 39:6, but Joseph was well built and very handsome. Does that make him a good boyfriend for your daughter? When you have that going for you, the world looks up, and they certainly take notice. Joseph had lots going for him. Back home, he was Jacob's favorite. As a slave owned by Potiphar, he was his favorite too. Joseph became Potiphar's wife's favorite. But that shouldn't have happened. It all begins when Joseph is dumped off as a slave at the auction block in Egypt by a handful of Ishmaelites. I'll read it for you. Verse 1 of chapter 39 of Genesis. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites. I'll bet that was quite a sight. Imagine a slave auction. Joseph, prime candidate, reduced to an animal, just like selling a horse or a cow. Ugly, distasteful, humiliating, not to speak of cruel and inhumane. 17-year-old boy, paraded as a slave, in full view of the leering crowd, wearing only a loincloth, and he was up for sale. What do you think he was worth? What would you pay for him? You be Joseph. You're a captive. You're in a foreign country, hundreds of miles from home, no parents, no family, no friends. You don't speak their language. They speak Egyptian. You're a Hebrew. You're a misfit foreigner. You got no passport, and you got no ID. He hears the auctioneer jabbering in a language that he can't even understand. He doesn't know what he's saying. He sees all their eyes glaring at him. Some are pointing their finger. He can see them thinking. He can see them planning. Finally, what seems to be forever, Joseph listens to the gavel come down with a bang. It was over. The man over there, the best dressed man in the room, he bought him. He was an official. His name is Potiphar. Everybody in the room knew who he was because he was Pharaoh's head of the KGB, secret police force, and he was the chief executioner. He was also the head of the Egyptian penal system. Every prison in Egypt was under his command. In chains, Joseph was led from that room, no doubt under heavy guard, placed on a wagon, led out of the city. From his seat in custody, he was drawn up to a palatial mansion. It was Potiphar's. It was his private estate. Joseph was unseated in front of the slaves' quarters, ushered inside, given fresh clothes, hot meal, shown finally to his sleeping quarters. The whole day had been nothing but a whirlwind. He closed his eyes in exhaustion. And he said this prayer. God, what's going on? Why did you bring me here? Have you forgotten me? Class, have you ever been there? Have you ever said what Joseph just said? What's going on? Have you forgotten me? Well, you're not alone. Joseph said it before you did. Joseph had no communication with home. He couldn't text his dad. He couldn't email his school teacher. Forlorn, all alone. Now what? 17 years old. Little did he know, I repeat, little did he know that years later, he's going to look back at this dark hour and he's going to utter these words to his brothers. Be not grieved, nor angry with yourself. God did this. He sent me here to Egypt before you. God did this. He sent me here before you. I want you all to know and remember, when life passes, we've all looked back. And those hideous, rotten events in our life, to you then, it was just total mystery. It was nothing but grief. Now, knowing what happened, you can see the hand of God. You only saw the malice and the cruelty of man. Now it makes sense. God did this. He sent me here ahead of you. Okay, let's pick up the beginnings in this new land. Verse 2, chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and he became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed that household of that Egyptian, all because of Joseph. And the blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. And so he left in Joseph's care everything he had. He didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. What do you think of that? Do you want a good book on management? Have you ever read a book on management? There are all kinds of them out there. You can go to university and get a degree in management. Did you know that? Well, listen. The best book that you'll ever read on management is all condensed into just 6 verses. These ones that I'm going to read to you. They're very short. They're found in Genesis 39. And here they are. 3 things. 1, show up. Do you want to be a good manager? Show up. 2, put out. Do something with what you just showed up with. Put out. 3, gather in. Let me show them to you. Here's the first one, verse 2. As it turned out, God was with Joseph, and things went very well with him, and he ended up living in the home of his Egyptian master. Here's the first lesson in management. Show up. Bill Gates, he had a father whose dad was also called Bill. He was a tall man, 6'4". He was a lawyer. He lived in Seattle, where Bill Gates grew up. When his son became a billionaire, remember, he was the founder of Microsoft. Everyone wanted to know from little Bill's dad, how did your son get to be so successful? Here was his answer. He wrote a book on management. Do you know what he called it? Showing Up. And if you read the book, just a simple little book, the essence of the book is this. Most people aren't successful because they never show up. He said, my son, Bill Gates Jr., he showed up. He loved software, and he worked at it night and day. Suddenly, born was a lovely computer company called Software, Microsoft, and that company has become perhaps the most successful company in the whole computer world. Joseph showed up. I would guess probably between the verse 1 and verse 6 of 39, we pick out that he was 5 or 6 years older than the 17 years. Joseph didn't speak the language, but he was a great student. It wasn't long before he learned the Egyptian language, and he spoke it fluently. He was thrust into a slave quarters at Potiphar's estate, along with 200 or 300 other slaves. He wasn't the only one. And the estate was huge. Thousands of acres. Farms, silos, rivers, lakes, cattle, sheep, little villages, their own fire department, their own police force. Potiphar had slaves from all over. He had them from Saudi Arabia, he had them from Persia, he had them from India, he had them from South Africa, he even had them from Europe. Joseph is going to end up managing all of those slaves from all of those parts of the world. And he's going to do it before he's 25 years old. What's his secret? Hundreds of slaves, workers under his watchful eye. Verse 3 and 4. His master recognized that God was with him. And he saw that God was working for good in everything that he did. Did you notice? Joseph wasn't on the job. He didn't show up alone. The Bible says that God was with him. That's your first lesson in management. Show up. But don't show up alone. Take God along with you. Yeah, but I'm working with atheists, I can hear you say. Have you ever worked with atheists, Ron? I bet you haven't. You've just worked in the church all your life, right? Do you know what Joseph did? His boss, Potiphar, was an atheist. He was an idolater. He worshipped the Egyptian sun god. He didn't know God Jehovah. But you know what happens to idolaters and atheists? Over time, when you're there working with them and you show up, they recognize that God is with you. And it gets better. God was working for good for them. In everything that he did, they got the spin-off. They got the bonus of him being a follower of his Lord. Your first lesson in management, show up. But don't show up alone. Bring God along with you. 2, here's a second lesson. Put out. Verse 3. Things went very well with Joseph, and he ended up living in the house of his Egyptian master. When you're the head of Pharaoh's KGB, and your living quarters are palatial, it's like a Windsor Castle or a Buckingham Palace. Remember this. Potiphar was like a little king, ruling over his little kingdom. He wanted his management close by. Joseph, in his 6 years, He rose to the top to become his CEO. After he showed up, I read that he put out. His slave became his CEO, Chief Executive Officer. Potiphar, he wanted somebody to manage his company who had hands-on skills, and he moved him right into the palace, right beside where he lived. Verse 5. He became very fond of Joseph, and he made him his personal aide. Those words are from the Message Bible. Don't you love stories of people like Joseph who become rags to riches? Let me tell you something. Have you ever heard of Marcus Tullius Tiro? Well, Cicero, he was the ancient Roman great philosopher and lawyer. He wrote more Latin, and it was put onto parchment, and it was passed on to the next generation, and then on it went, and it became really the foundation of the Enlightenment and also the Reformation. All the writings of Cicero. You're saying, well, can one man write all of that? No, he can't. Well, how do we know what he wrote, and how is it all put together? There's a secret. There's a young slave in ancient Rome who was illiterate. Cicero found him, and he taught him. And he taught him to become a scholar in both Latin and Greek. Do you know what he did for Cicero? He became his personal secretary. He took notes. Do you want to know how he put out for his boss? He invented the shorthand. It's been used for 2,000 years. Tiro, from an illiterate young slave, translated into manuscript every word that Cicero said, and it became polished literature. All he learned was shorthand, and from his system of shorthand, he went home and he took his quill and he began to write. And now we have the history of some of the best writings of the ancient world, and 1/3 of all the Latin that was ever published during the time of the Roman Caesars was Cicero's. I wonder why. Well, it was because of this fella Tiro. He did shorthand, and he wrote down everything that Cicero said. Here's another rags to riches. Margaret LaHand. She was the personal secretary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Served that president for over 20 years. She was so trusted, and she was so competent, that Roosevelt called her my right-hand woman. What was her put out? She rose from assistant in the White House to become the chief of staff. She's the only woman in American history to do that. That's put out in management. Every secret that Roosevelt had, he trusted to Margaret LaHand, and she wrote it down, and she became his trusted confidant. Rags to riches. One more. Kathy McKeon. She was an immigrant. She came to the United States from Ireland. The year was 1963. Her family, they came to the Americas because of poverty. They were very poor. She was only 19 years old. She grew up in a household with no electricity, and all 10 kids shared the same toothbrush. Only one toothbrush, 10 children. Just perchance, she was at a meeting, and she couldn't remember afterwards what the meeting was even about or why she was there. However, there was a lady there that talked with her and met her, and that lady was Jackie Kennedy. She was so intrigued by talking to this little lady from Ireland that she said to her, having looked at this shiny, humble personality, she said, "Do you have a job?" She said, "No, I don't." "Do you live in New York?" "Oh, yes, I live with my family in New York." Kathy said to her, "Is there a reason?" Jackie Kennedy looked at her and said, "I need an assistant. Could you come and become my assistant? I want somebody that I can trust, and I want somebody that I can confide in, and I want her to live with me in our apartment, and I want you to become like a servant for me. Have you ever thought of doing that?" She said, "Yes, I'd be glad to do that." For the next 13 years, she became Jackie Kennedy's confidant. She went from New York when he was elected president of the United States. She went and lived in the White House. She was in the Oval Office. President Jack Kennedy knew her almost as his own daughter, all because she showed up and she knew how to put out. That's management. All right. Told you 2 secrets. 1, Joseph showed up. 2, he put out. 1 more. He gathered in. Verse 6 and 5. Potiphar put Joseph in charge of all his personal affairs, turning everything over to him. And from that moment on, God blessed that house of the Egyptian because Joseph was there. And that blessing spread over everything that he owned, both in the house and in the field. Talk about gathering in. What do you know? A young slave immigrant, rejected and maligned, couldn't speak the language, bought for cheap at the slave market, employed by Pharaoh, second highest man in all of Egypt, greatest big shot in the nation next to the Pharaoh. His stock doubled because of him, and he gathered in. It says that under his management, Joseph gathered in, and at the tail end of the book, if you read Genesis and get to the tail end, the last chapter, chapter 49, verse 22, his dad Jacob is reading his final will and testament to his 12 boys. Here's what he gives and talks about with Joseph. Talk about gathering in. "Joseph," says Jacob, "is a fruitful vine near the spring, whose branches climb over the wall, and they bear luscious fruit. Archers shot at him, but they missed, because God's mighty hand was upon him." I think Potiphar would agree with that. That was a great endorsement. When he turned over to Joseph all his personal affairs, it seems that all his vines climbed over the wall, and the blessing of God spread over everything that he owned. Do you think every once in a while, when Potiphar laid his head down on the pillow, he's about to go to sleep, do you think it crossed his mind, "I've never gathered in this much in all my life. Where did I find this Joseph fellow? Where'd he come from? I haven't seen anything like him, not in Pharaoh's court, nor in any Egyptian university, nor in any of the neighboring countries. Every place I visit, I've been looking to try and find a duplicate of this fellow Joseph, and I can't find one. I'm becoming the wealthiest businessman in all of Egypt. And it's not me. It's all because of a young slave that I purchased down at the auction block for nothing. I got the best business manager in the country. Discovery class, in the very next chapter that I'm going to show you, Joseph's life is going to change. Everything that he has done is not going to be what I just told you. But the lesson that I have given you in management doesn't change. Here are the three things I want you to practice. 1, show up. 2, put out. 3, I want you to gather in. Finally, do you want to know what happened to Joseph? I want you to come back next week and I'll tell you. Till then, you have a good week. And I'll see you when you come back. Bye.